Stanford professor Morris Fiorina is the author of this book. Several editions of this book have come out. Culture War, The Myth of a Polarized America. Professor Fiorina, are we divided into red and blue camps in this country?
It depends on who you mean by we. If you mean by the people who are very active in politics, who run for office, who work in the campaigns and give money, yes, they are. If you mean by we, the ordinary average American citizen who basically just turns out to vote, the answer is no, we are not.
How do you find that?
We find that through very intensive looks at American surveys, the American National Election Studies, the General Social Survey, some of the good commercial surveys like Gallup, etc. And what they show basically is the American electorate today doesn't look any different in terms of its partisanship or its ideology or its issue positions than the American electorate in the 1970s. So the electoral changes we're seeing are changes being driven by the people at the elite level, the people who are most active in politics. They are clearly very different. They are much more polarized, much more ideological. Their priorities are different, but it's not the ordinary vote. The ordinary voter can only vote between the alternatives that he or she is provided. And if they're given only extremists to vote for or against, that's all they can vote for as an extremist.
Now, Professor Fiorina, you started writing this series or this book in 2006 or so.
Actually, 2003.
2003. Have you done an updated one since the 2012 presidential election?
No, I haven't. 2012 was a status quo election. Very little changed, and so there wasn't any real need to do anything. I've looked at the data and concluded that nothing needs to be readdressed.
So when you look at some of the issues that we talk about in the states, and we're up here in Northern California and Silicon Valley at Stanford, are we in a completely blue area?
Yes, we are. Yes, this area, what you look at when you see a map of California is some very deep blue pockets, especially along the coasts and in the major metropolitan areas, and then redder areas everywhere else. Wherever you have a lot of redwood trees and a lot of cows and a lot of farms, desert, you tend to see more red.
Right, but in Silicon Valley itself, are there red pockets? Are there people who aren't that polarized, or are they polarized?
There are people, look, there are political differences everywhere, even in Manhattan there are political differences, and you'll find them here too, but what makes it difficult for even people you would normally think of as Republicans, wealthy people who have a lot of stock options, etc. The California Republican Party looks more like a Texas Republican Party. I've joked to some of my Republican friends that your platform is to log the redwoods, kill the salmon, and bash gays. And that just doesn't appeal even to wealthy people in this area. That they vote regularly for Democrats who are going to raise their taxes because they basically have no choice. So I mean, again, you can't really tell what people are thinking from how they're voting, because they can only vote between two alternatives. And so just the fact that they're continually voting for Democrats doesn't mean that given a different kind of Republican, a Pete Wilson kind of Republican, a George Dumajian kind of Republican, even a Ronald Reagan kind of Republican, the voting patterns might be very different than what we're getting now.
And that's because the Republican Party itself is controlled by...
The brand, if you talk to the people here, the former Republican state chairman, the current state chairman, they realize that a lot of the base, the Republican base in California, has its roots in the more deserty rural areas, and the social issues are very strong with them, and they'd rather lose with a social conservative than win with a moderate. And that's why Schwarzenegger was such an anomaly, that he probably couldn't have made it through a Republican primary in California, but the recall gave him the opportunity to run when the entire electorate was voting.
You have a chart in this book, and I want to ask you if this is still up to date when it comes to Congress. This is Congress in the 1960s. You can see the blue and the red, and you can see overlap here. And then you say that Congress has gotten more and more polarized.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
That has not changed in the slightest.
How has this happened?
This has happened. There are a couple of things going on here. One is simply change, social and demographic change in the country. That African Americans moved north from the South, making Northern Democrats a more racially liberal party. The Sun Belt, the tremendous growth of the Sun Belt led to the South becoming a more conservative and economically region. We've seen the various 60s social movements align with one party or the other, the environmentalists, the women's movement, et cetera, with the Democrats, the religious right with the Republicans. And these have driven basically the two parties apart. The argument I make continually is what's happened in the U.S. is sorting, not polarization. That a generation ago, or most people are getting to the point where most people are younger than I am now, but I remember when there were lots of conservative Democrats and lots of liberal Republicans. In the Northeast, you had highly liberal senators like Jacob Javits, a Republican. In the South, you had conservative Democrats. Whereas now, basically they've disappeared in both parties at the highest levels. You have very few conservatives in the Democratic Party, very few liberals in the Republican Party. And so the parties have been driven apart. But the actual number of liberals, conservatives, Democrats, and Republicans hasn't changed all that much, if anything, since the 1970s. So people are much better sorted now. And the result is the bases of the two parties, the activists, are highly polarized because they're sorted out, and they're pretty much the same. Massachusetts Democrats and Mississippi Democrats aren't that different in the base, and same thing for Republicans, contrary to a generation ago. And so politics has become more polarized, but it's not because the middle has disappeared. It's not because there are fewer moderates. It's just the middle has a home in neither party now. The middle is basically adrift.
Professor Fiorina, what about hot-button issues? Gay marriage, gun control, abortion. Aren't we divided on those issues? I mean, isn't there a clear yes and no?
We are divided again if you think of we as the political elites. This is something that's not really appreciated. Right now, since Obama's election and his inaugural address, what are some of the issues he's focused on? He said, we're going to deal with gun control, we're going to deal with immigration, we're going to deal with global warming. The Pew Foundation, the Pew Research Center, a very reputable organization, put out a poll in January. And the poll asked people, what do you think the priorities, the major priorities of the President and the Congress should be in the coming year? And there were 21 options. Immigration was 17 out of 21. Gun control was 18 out of 21. This is a month after Sandy Hill. And global warming was 21 out of 21. And this is a point I've made in the books, that the priorities of the political class are often very different from the priorities of the American public. The American public is concerned with bread and butter issues, especially at a time like this. They're concerned about their jobs, the economy, deficits, health care, their kids' schools, etc. And I'm not saying these other issues aren't important. I'm just saying from the standpoint of the average voter, these are way down their list of priorities. And yet that's the subject of my second book, actually, Disconnect. It's not the subject, but one of the things we deal with in this one is the priorities of the political class. And the things we fight our politics over are things that are generally not high up on the priority list of the American public.
Why is that?
It's because these things are very important to the political class. We have a Democratic Party. It's been described as limousine liberal, and I think there's a certain element to that. And the Republicans, for their part, have allied with the religious right, and so they in fact, these issues are of deep concern to them, and yet not so much to the average American. There has been this poll asking for years and years about the most important issues facing the Republic, and the only one I've ever seen where gay marriage was not at the bottom was one that included tort reform. And most Americans, of course, have no idea what a tort is. And so tort reform came in dead last in that one. But usually, I mean, especially in an area like this, if you tell people, the polls say that Americans don't really care all that much about gay marriage, people just don't believe you. But just survey after survey shows that.
What do people in Oklahoma and Northern California, where are they going to agree?
I think if you put
and when I say Northern California, I should say
I think if you put
the
them into a room, and again, we're talking here not about people really active in politics who give money, but just go pick up a bunch of people off the Oklahoma street, Norman Street. Well, Norman's probably it's the university town, so that's not a good idea. But take some city or take some urban area here, put them down in the room, they start talking, and they find out, gee, we're not all that different. That they can sort of, it's not going to be we solve the deficit entirely through cutting spending or entirely through raising taxes. It's going to be some of both. And let's talk about where we could find common ground. And I think on issue after issue, you'll find that. I get a certain number of calls from reporters who report that they decided to do one of these red-blue comparisons. And so they went into a neighborhood and they say, well, I couldn't find it. I talked to the reddest person on the block, a Republican, and it turned out they were the best friends of the bluest person on the block. And I think when you talk about ordinary, reasonable Americans, as opposed to the ones who watch the shows on TV and who sort of try to convince each other about how pure they are in their political views,